It's a power-packed show we have lined up for you, but we start first on the face-off between India and China in the Doklam Plateau in Bhutan. It could be the most serious of its kind in recent years. It certainly holds the potential of escalation, but first a quick recap about what happened on the plateau. Now, the Doklam Plateau in western Bhutan measures about 270 square kilometers, but it is claimed by China. In fact, China's attempt at road building here is what precipitated the current crisis. China needs the road to run through the Doklam Plateau for ease of military movement. All right, to break down the significance of the Doklam Plateau and what's really going on between India and China, I am joined in the studio by Professor Swaran Singh. He is from the prestigious Jawaharlal Nehru University, the School of International Studies at the university, in fact. Good evening, Professor. Thanks very much for joining us. Just to set the ball rolling on this conversation, if you can give us an idea of the strategic importance of the Doklam Plateau and China's claims of this being its region.
In mountain regions, plateau is always a place of advantage, whether it is for surveillance or in actual war fighting. The heights are always preferred, but we are not looking at that kind of problem anymore. It's going to be much more of power projection and potential access to the vulnerable areas of India. And in that sense, building road up to this plateau would mean that China would be able to draw at least small size main battle tanks, and they are already experimenting on 35-ton main battle tanks in Tibet areas, and they are planning to build here what is called 40-ton road.
Okay.
So that access to coming so close to India's what we call chicken's neck is something that makes it very sensitive for both India and China. Both are trying to really make sure that such a road does not, both are trying to ensure that such a plateau is in their control. And Chinese apparently are in control at this stage, and they are trying to make this road, which is not good news for India.
All right, but when it comes to Bhutan's point of view in all of this, Bhutan has in fact gone ahead and accused China of trespass in the region. Is Bhutan's sovereignty being ignored in all of this?
Yes, definitely. This whole area was once being talked about between Chinese and Bhutanese who are negotiating border from 1984. In 1996, there was a news that Chinese had made an offer to swap a certain space in the north with this area in the west, where they were willing to give about 500 kilometers for this 269 kilometers. And then BBC had even published news saying that perhaps Bhutan had accepted it, but it was clarified by the king at that time in National Assembly that they had not accepted it, and that region, which is now in controversy, was actually claimed by Bhutan. So it's actually an attack on Bhutanese sovereignty by Chinese. And because Bhutan has a very special relationship with India historically, and for their defense and foreign policy, they often consult India for their advice. And in that sense, India gets clearly involved in ensuring. In fact, Nehru in 1956 had told the parliament in a speech saying, any aggression on Bhutan will be treated as an aggression on India.
All
so
right.
in that sense, India gets directly involved in this conflict.
Okay, stay with me, Professor. I'm also joined by the President of the Center for China Analysis and Studies, Jayadev Ranade. Good evening, Mr. Ranade. Thanks for joining us here on the broadcast. If I can just ask you to give us an idea of how concerned you think India needs to be about these rather aggressive overtures from China when it comes to this, what we're given to understand, a very strategic area for not just the Chinese but India as well.
I think India is concerned, and at the same time it is fairly confident of its position, as we have seen from the statement that was issued earlier today. The area itself, if I may just mention, the Doklam Plateau is part of Bhutanese territory, and it has always been part of Bhutanese territory. The Chinese have intruded there in the past, and they have started road construction activity many years ago, and they have been trying to pursue building that road. We come in because of our special relationship with Bhutan, where, as the previous speaker mentioned, our Prime Minister at that time, Prime Minister Nehru, had said that any aggression on Bhutan is like an aggression in India. But that apart, there are 2 points that have to be kept in mind as to why India gets concerned. The first is the Chumbi Valley, which is like a dagger pointing down to the Siliguri corridor, or what is called the Chicken's Neck, which is a narrow strip of land connecting the mainland with our northeast. That becomes extremely vulnerable if the Chinese come down through to the tip of the Chumbi Valley, which they will if they build this road. Second, the Chinese view a place called Gemochen, right at the tip of this Chumbi Valley, as the tri-junction. Whereas we, since including in our Survey of India maps of 1956, view a place called Batangla, which is about 14 kilometers north of Gemochen, as the tri-junction. And that should be the tri-junction because it is on the watershed. But the Chinese are unwilling to accept it because they want to push the McMahon line. They don't want to accept the McMahon line.
Okay.
And they want to reassert their claim over Arunachal, which they can do if they push for Gemochen.
Right.
So they are strengthening their effort to get a claim on Arunachal, and that is these 2 points are the ones that concern us.
All right, sir. Thanks for breaking it down for us. I'll ask you to stay with me on the broadcast. I just want to take our viewers through why exactly India has chosen to intervene in this situation. Now, India took the step to stop the Chinese road building after a Bhutanese attempt failed. A 2007 treaty commits the two to consult and cooperate to safeguard their national interests. Now, India is training the Bhutanese army and has a brigade stationed in a place called Ha in Bhutan. Professor Swaran Singh, do you see also, you mentioned that Bhutan's sovereignty is being ignored in all of this, but is this also a very significant move on the part of India in terms of the region to show that it stands by its ally in not just in spirit but in actual action as well?
I think that is expected of India. You know, India has, as I said, special relationship with Bhutan, and as Ranade just mentioned, it's not the first time. Of course, it is more aggressive this time. It's of a larger scale. But this is, if not first time, India has repeatedly responded whenever such situations have arisen earlier. And it is part of standing up to China in that sense. You know, the more you let them do things, the more they will be emboldened in doing. And they are doing the same thing with all their neighbors. So India is not the only country they are showing this kind of aggressive attitude. They are showing such attitude to all the neighbors. So in that sense, maybe we also need to coordinate with other neighbors as to how to together respond to Chinese. Indeed, different neighbors sometimes behave differently. ASEAN has one kind of behavior. For example, Philippines president has really ignored the arbitration.
Absolutely.
So in that sense, each neighbor is responding in their own fashion, but India being the largest neighbor of China, maybe holds that responsibility to collaborate with other neighbors and see what can be done in sort of restraining that aggression.
And in fact, we can never ignore the elephant in the room when it comes to India and China, and that is Pakistan. And if I can take that across to Mr. Ranade, sir, when we look at this entire story in the larger global context and the sort of political maneuvers that have been going on, can we ignore the meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi when we're looking at China's more aggressive stance in a region that we've really not seen any sort of skirmishes in before?
Not at all. In fact, China would have been quite, I think, upset after the Prime Minister Modi's meeting with Trump, and particularly the press conference thereafter. China, in any case, has a very uncertain relationship with the US after Trump took over as president. Despite the meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump, which also, as you know, was not without some embarrassment for the Chinese. They have suffered another embarrassment very recently when the US State Department released its human rights report and named China as the #1 offender in human rights cases. That was on Tuesday. But so certainly that is an issue. China has been very concerned about what it thinks are US designs to destabilize China, and they feel that, you know, the US and India coming closer together is something aimed at containing China. But may I mention 2 other points when you were discussing the wider implications of this incident. The first, I think we should remember, is that China has picked on the smallest neighbor that it has for mounting this unwanted aggression, which is Bhutan. Second, as far as India's stand is concerned, by making the statement that we did today, we have also signaled that we are not going to back off in the face of pressure when our sovereignty and territorial interests are going to be impacted. And I think that message will go through not only to our neighbors but also to others who are looking for a good partner, who are looking for a strong partner, and I think India is signaling that it will fit that bill.
Okay, stay with me, sir. I'm also joined on the broadcast by former ambassador to China for India, Ashok K. Kanta. Also with us via Skype from Beijing is political and economic commentator Ainar Tangen. Thank you both for joining in on the broadcast. I have one follow-up question for Mr. Ranade. I understand he's not going to be on the broadcast for much longer. Mr. Ranade, one last question to you. Do you think, looking at, I'm going to use the terminology that the MEA used today, when it said that when it comes to India, that such construction would represent a significant change of status quo with serious security implications for India. Do you think that the point has been made strongly enough to China, or is this still couched within the niceties of diplomatic intervention?
Well, I mean, the language is polite, as all diplomats craft their letters, but the message, I think, is very clear. The fact that we have not backed off, the fact that we are not talking about making concessions, and the fact that on both sides troops have been reinforced, I think indicates that they are preparing for a extended face-off if necessary. But at the same time, I think neither side really wants to precipitate an issue or wants it to escalate out of hand. But as far as India is concerned, I don't think that it is going to back off. It will stay firm and at the same time try and defuse matters by trying to contact the appropriate authorities on the Chinese side.
All right, Mr. Ranade, appreciate you joining us here on WION with your perspective. Always nice to hear what you have to say. I'm going to come to my other guests in just a second. I want to take our viewers through another set of graphics that we've got arranged for you. Now, reports are saying that India has moved 3,000 troops to the disputed location. Apparently, China has done the same. As diplomatic parleys continue, experts and analysts say that both sides have major stakes in the current standoff. Now, the president of China, Xi Jinping, hopes to cement his power at the National People's Congress in October. He therefore cannot afford to climb down or show any sign of weakness. His rivals in the Chinese political system will be looking for any chink in his armor to bring him down. Now, President Xi must also not lose face with the Chinese military. Ainar Tangen, is that a safe assessment that domestic policy in some ways is dictating the way China is conducting its overtures and maneuvers when it comes to the Doklam Plateau?
Xi, it's just on the eve of his next term. Obviously, he's very concerned with making sure that things go smoothly as possible. This is not in the playbook. Now, let us be frank. The issue here, it's not just one side. India has been building roads and also airports that are capable of handling heavy transports in other areas along the disputed zone.
Ainar, allow me to come in. We're having a bit of an issue with your audio. We're going to try and fix that. While we do, I'm just going to take you through another set of information. But the stakes, as we were saying, are equally high for India because Prime Minister Narendra Modi has opted for a tough stance as well. He will not waver in the defense of his close ally Bhutan. India will also stand by agreements that it has committed to. Now, it's not clear exactly how the situation on the Doklam Plateau could unfold. India doesn't want war, but will also not hold back on defense of its interests. In the case of China, though, President Xi Jinping's political ambitions could push him into endorsing a confrontation which could rebound on China, given that its actions have not endeared it in either way in Asia or anywhere else. Let me go across to the ambassador. Ambassador, would it be safe to assume at this point in time that as China has its domestic policy perhaps dictating the terms of engagement at this point in time, the same can be said of India and Prime Minister Narendra Modi as well?
No, it's a fact that to some extent domestic politics does impact on behavior in external dimension. But let me also point out that there have been situations involving military standoff between India and China. The difference this time is that we have presence of a third country as well, Bhutan. But in the past, we have been able to resolve these situations, and I do hope that this time also two countries will have wise counsel on both sides and will be able to resolve the situation.
Professor Swaran Singh, we began the conversation talking about the strategic importance of this particular area in terms of the geographical context, but we can't really ignore politics at this point either. And do you think that that is something that, as we're looking at the larger implications, we have to look at how this affects India's stature on the global stage as well?
I think it doesn't do well to either China or India to get into repeated conflicts of this nature. Both are rapidly emerging as global players, and I think there need to be at least some kind of coordination, if not cooperation, between these two states. I have often said that these conflicts on the border have become a medium of signaling each other the displeasure, and possibly it applies to both sides. And this kind of upping the ante and carrying on with that confrontation for a longer period of time is not good for us. Even our immediate neighbors will be using us, between one and the other, and of course big powers will do the same thing. So it's not good for India and China to sustain such, other than keeping it a brief time signaling method to tell other what is the problem. And Chinese are of course clearly upset. This is the first time that Donald Trump has met a leader and has not demolished or destroyed what Obama used to do before.
Right.
All his earlier actions are to put an end to those policies, and this is, in that sense, is a continuation of support with India, either with fighting on terrorism, but more important, talking of freedom of navigation and aviation in Indo-Pacific region, which is clearly indication to Chinese. So Chinese have taken note of it, and I think fundamentally it's politics, as you said. If at the helm politicians begin to understand they need to sort of calm down and cool down, mechanisms on the ground, as Ambassador said, are already there, and they have worked so many times before.
Right.
So they are ready to find solutions and cool down the environment, provided there is a signal from the top.
But then we wouldn't be having this conversation in that case. Stay with me, gentlemen. I just want to run you through, as the professor was pointing out, there's no change in the policy when it comes to the United States towards India, but there's also a very long history of no change when it comes to India and China. And India's intervention this time around was also driven by the concern that China was building its infrastructure in the Chumbi Valley, which is a narrow stretch of Chinese territory. But to just take you through the significance of what's happened in the past. Now, India's Ministry of External Affairs is taking on a more decisive and vocal avatar vis-a-vis China. In its 70 years since independence, India and China have clashed several times, but New Delhi has remained largely silent and on the back foot as far as powerful nuclear neighbor China is concerned. But with a firm and new decisive foreign policy forged over the past 3 years by a government with a definitive majority in New Delhi, South Bloc is silent no more and has just denounced China's latest claim of a remote North Bhutanese plateau in no uncertain terms. But what have been the main instigators of conflict between the two nations that have enjoyed trade since ancient times? Well, our senior foreign editor Padma Rao takes us through the timeline of the India-China conflict. Take a look.
Their relationship goes back at least 2,000 years and revolved mostly around trade. But the first clash between India and China came in the 18th century over Tibet and Ladakh. However, and since both sides were preoccupied by other conflicts, they backed off. By the early 50s, both India and China were modern nations. India had just shaken off British rule, while the People's Republic of China was born on the other side of the Himalayas. But the first seed of discontent was sown by the Tibet question. There was disagreement over Aksai Chin, and then, when the Dalai Lama received refuge in India, the Chinese saw it as plain interference. In 1962, the cauldron of mutual discontent boiled over. A short border war erupted. India was defeated and pushed back to within 48 kilometers of the Assam plains in the northeast. China occupied portions of Ladakh. The war sent relations between the two countries into the deepest freeze they had ever known. It was the quiet mountain pass of Nathula in Sikkim that was to be the next flashpoint. In 1967, Chinese troops opened fire at Indian soldiers stationed there. 62 Indian troops lost their lives. The fire wasn't out yet. Just days later, the two sides used machine guns upon each other at Chola, another outpost in Sikkim. 88 Indians and 300 Chinese troops lost their lives. By the early 70s, what had begun as border wars had turned into political maneuvers. Flashpoints remain to date, with the Chinese now beginning to change positions as and when political developments prompt them to. India's military protection of Bhutan was not high on China's list of resentments till the emergence of new political alliances. India's engagement with the United States and Japan is growing. New Delhi has been vocal on Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea. No surprises then that China now has its eye on a hitherto undisputed part of Bhutan. The dragon's breathing fire again, but this time the elephant is not crouching. Padma Rao, WION.
All right, Tom McGregor, the editor for CCTV, joins in on the conversation from Beijing as well. Good evening, Tom. Thanks for speaking with us. If I can ask you, what sort of, let's say, reaction has India's latest stance on this skirmish made when it comes to China? Are people paying attention to what's going on, or is this one-sided in terms of media attention?
To be honest, it hasn't really been a major focus right now here in Beijing or most of China. The big media story right now in China is about Xi Jinping visiting Hong Kong in regards to the 20th anniversary of Hong Kong becoming part of China. So this happens to occur around the same time Beijing has made all of these preparations for the Hong Kong trip. So what we have here is basically the Indian border situation is more of a distraction than anything else. But I do anticipate that if it escalates even further, then yes, it will become a major and a much bigger media story here in China.
All right, Ambassador Kantha, Tom there saying that the Indian border story is a sort of a distraction when it comes to the Chinese media. But in the same way, one can also say that it seems that the skirmish along the border is a distraction from the bonhomie that was on display between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. Which distraction do we pay more attention to?
The bigger distraction will
clearly,
be
from what we are aware,
that was for Ambassador Kantha. Sir, go ahead.
Yeah. From what we have learnt about the meeting, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi at Astana, it was a good meeting. I believe through this meeting, relations were moving along on a relatively hopeful trajectory. This incident is no doubt a negative development. Chinese, both in terms of their behavior on the ground as well as pronouncements, Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of National Defense have been making, have led to escalation of situation. I think what needs to be done today is China paying heed to request received from Bhutan that they should restore status quo as before 16 June 2017. And then two sides can have discussions both between India and China and Bhutan and China and try and find a resolution to this situation of a standoff.
Okay, Einar Tangen is back with us. Einar, good to have you back. We're constantly talking about India and China here, and it seems like Bhutan, which is really the focal point of this conversation, doesn't seem to be getting the attention it deserves. But I want to take you through what one of the Foreign Ministry spokesperson from China said today. He said that Indian troops must first withdraw from the Doklam area over which Beijing has indisputable sovereignty. At a time when China is trying to remind the world of its sovereignty over Taiwan, over Tibet. It's talking about indisputable sovereignty over an area which is quite clearly a part of Bhutan. What do you make of that? Is this double standards by China?
No, I don't think so. There's a long historical record that there is disputed territory there. Obviously, Beijing is not going to come out and say that this is not something important. I think we're a little bit puzzled. This is between China and Bhutan, but India has crossed the line. If you recall, a couple of days ago, the last 2 days, we've been talking about this issue as if China had somehow made an incursion into India. You remember the showing of the troops pushing each other around and a lot of vocal noise about China must retreat from the area. Now, as it turned out, out, it was India who crossed the line in aid of its ally, Bhutan. The question is, are they going to stay there? And is that acceptable? I don't, given that this area is in fact under the control of China. Now, if you go to other areas like Andhra Pradesh, you'll note that India has built airstrips and also heavy roads that can accommodate tanks. They completed a bridge. This is also something, but I don't think that China was willing to go across and try to interrupt the road building or airfield building that India was doing, because it is on India's side of the area. So I think this is a bit of a escalation. It's going to be difficult to solve. I think Modi and Xi eventually will have to talk about this one-on-one.
All right, Professor. Allow me to come in, Einar. Professor Swaran Singh, what do you make of that contention that this is a dispute between China and Bhutan and India is the third party here? Would you agree with that?
I think it's very unfortunate that Chinese are putting a precondition before any consultations on the subject begin. It's a disputed territory, we are in a conflict, we are trying to resolve it through dialogue. It cannot start with preconditions, and Chinese are putting certain preconditions. All three parties here will have their own version. For example, Bhutanese can easily cite the 1998 treaty that they have for peace and tranquility on the border, that says very clearly that both sides will ensure that the status quo before 1959 is maintained on the border. So Bhutanese have a sovereignty in this area. Chinese have their own version, of course. But when you have a conflict and you are trying to resolve it through dialogue, I think putting conditions of who will withdraw where first is a clear non-starter, and it shows clear intention of not resolving and keeping the tension on in this area, which is not very helpful. Beijing should not put any preconditions, and dialogue should begin and find a solution to the problem.
Okay, fair enough. Ambassador Kant, I understand you have a reaction. Please go ahead.
Let me just point out that there are clear understandings between China and Bhutan. Agreements of 1988 and 1998, which require China to respect the status quo. China is not doing that. The very fact that it's trying to construct a road in Doklam Plateau, the presence of bulldozer there shows that China is changing the status quo. It's unfortunate that China is trying to bully a small neighbor like Bhutan. As for India, I think for us also, China is trying to unilaterally change facts on the ground as far as tri-junction between India, Bhutan and China is concerned. This again is in violation of understanding reached between India and China in 2012. As you know, Ministry of External Affairs has rightly pointed out in a statement today, and the statement incidentally was measured and balanced, that this development, construction of road in Doklam Plateau, will have very serious security implications for India.
Absolutely.
Therefore, our concern is well-founded. Likewise, the Bhutanese position is also well-founded. China needs to respect Bhutan's sovereignty in this area. They may have claims on this area, but this is no way of asserting their claim. They need to withdraw from this area and try and resolve differences through consultations.
All right, Tom McGregor, you know, an interesting point brought up by the ambassador. It's in terms of the tone and tenor of the conversation as well. When we're looking and comparing the two statements made by the Ministry of External Affairs in India and the Foreign Ministry in China, there's a stark difference. I mean, the measured and composed tone of the MEA is met with a certain amount of aggression, if you ask me, when it comes to the Foreign Ministry. Do you think the semantics over here make a difference to the conversation as well, and something that we need to take note of?
Well, I'd like to first address the issue about the preconditions mentioned by one of the people who was talking earlier. The fact remains that in diplomacy, you normally have a lot of negotiations, and during negotiations, you would anticipate some people are going to ask for preconditions to engage in further diplomacy. So it does not surprise me that China is making certain requests or certain preconditions to start the negotiation process. Now, of course, it's India's decision whether or not they can accept the preconditions or not. But to say that it's outrageous that China is throwing out preconditions, to me, that's absurd. This is just basic negotiations that you deal with in diplomacy. So what I would like to argue is that, first of all, both sides in one sense have made some errors. So what needs to be addressed is just how to resolve the issue right now in a peaceful manner. And at the same time, for example, the pilgrims who would like to come in Tibet to visit the mountain to worship the Shiva god, they should be allowed to come in. They are not part of the problem. The real issue lies with the troops and the troops who are on the border.
But Tom,
So
don't you
my
think it's also
recommendation-
equally outrageous that China is talking about asking India to withdraw its troops when in fact it is Bhutan that has raised concern over China's construction of a road in the region, which it says is categorically its sovereign land. So isn't this a situation of the kettle calling the pot black?
No, this is not the case of Bhutan. I mean, obviously, in a recent press conference at the Foreign Ministry, they were showing photos of an Indian troops incursion, and they were showing actual weapons, or it looks like what looked like a tank to me was coming across the border. That seems rather threatening. So China's Foreign Ministry has the right to say this is incorrect, this is wrong, they need to pull back. So this is not just a Bhutan issue. This is an issue between India and China, and it just so happens it's also involves Bhutan. But I'm thinking about the actual border crossing right now is specifically about India and China.
Okay, I'm confused, gentlemen. Tom's saying that this is about India and China. Einar, you're saying this is about China and Bhutan. Which one of you do I believe?
Well, you should. We're not actually anything different. The actual dispute is between China and Bhutan. In terms of China, I think the ambassador has it standing wrong. There were talks, in fact, in the years that he mentioned, but there was no resolution that was accepted by both sides. As you know, it takes two to tango, and in that particular case, there's no agreement. So the area remains disputed. The fact is that Indian troops are on the other side, on the Chinese of the border, not in the area that is disputed by Bhutan. That's where the road is. The troops cross the area, they're using tanks. That is not in dispute.
All right.
Beijing says, look, get your troops away from our. That's entirely reasonable. It's reasonable as China saying that there is preconditions to any talks about Andhra Pradesh, that issue, of its plan.
Okay,
So
we're having trouble
engaged.
with your audio once again,
Issues
Einar.
here,
I'm going to
though,
try and
are
get
large.
that sorted so we can hear you clearly. Professor Swaran Singh, another thing that came up in the Foreign Ministry statement, and I'm quoting again, is that the spokesperson from China said that his country has indisputable sovereignty over the Dongklam area and that it was under Chinese administration from the Emperor Qing's dynasty. Now, I want to ask you that when it comes to, claims of sovereignty in these regions, there are a lot of oral, claims being made by a number of parties. Is the fact that there's nothing written down in paper and that these are just geographical boundaries that sort of creating more of a muddle in the region?
The very concept of sovereignty is related to the nation state. And that is very modern phenomenon. And both China and India are ancient civilizations. So it's perfectly okay for Chinese to say such thing, but it's factually wrong. Because when Qing dynasty was there was no idea of sovereignty. There was very different kind of political systems that existed. And we only had frontiers. We had no demarcated boundaries between us. And I think it is fair to say that it's a disputed territory. Every side has a version of their own. Chinese have their version. India has our own version. Bhutanese, I want to emphasize, is a sovereign state. And it is their problem vis-a-vis Chinese. India steps in because of our special relations with Bhutan. So we should not undermine the fact that Bhutan is the country which has a problem now with Chinese at this stage. They have their version of sovereignty. Chinese have theirs. Therefore, we need to consult and talk. I mean, we can't just say my version is going to be correct and it is undisputed territory as far as I'm concerned. All three will say the same thing. And therefore, need for discussion, need to use mechanisms and agreements that are already there. And I think that obviously needs a political signal, and I believe mechanisms can function if they are allowed to do so.
Okay, so schoolyard bullies may be playing in a rough playground, and poor Bhutan getting sort of left out and all of that. I'll leave it at that, gentlemen, but not before I thank each and every one of you. Mr. Ashok K. Kantha, Ambassador, thanks very much for being with us. Also, Aina Tangen, Tom McGregor, and of course, Professor Swaran Singh here in the studio with us. Thank you for taking out the time to speak with us.